Imagine losing your job tomorrow. No warning, no severance, no check coming in 2 weeks from the government to help you keep the lights on. Now imagine that there is no system anywhere that exists to catch you. No office to walk into, no phone number to call, no website to file a claim. You lose your income, and the very next morning, you are on your own. Completely. That is not a hypothetical scenario from some distant, undeveloped country. That was the United States of America for the first 159 years of its existence. From the founding of the Republic in 1776 all the way until 1935, there was no federal unemployment insurance in America. None. If you lost your job, whether through a financial panic, a factory closure, a seasonal layoff, or because your boss simply didn't like your face that morning, the government had absolutely nothing for you. No checks, no benefits, no retraining programs, nothing. And this wasn't some quiet policy gap that affected a handful of people on the margins. This was the daily, grinding reality for tens of millions of American workers across more than a century of industrialization, financial crises, depressions, and economic chaos. The country that was building railroads across continents, producing more steel than any nation on earth, and minting millionaires at a pace the world had never seen, had zero mechanism to help a laid-off steelworker feed his children. So, what did people actually do? When the factory gates shut, when the mines went dark, when the banks collapsed and the foreman told you not to come back on Monday. What happened next? The answer to that question is one of the most overlooked and devastating chapters in American history. And to understand it, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when the very concept of unemployment didn't even have a name. In the early decades of the American Republic, the economy looked nothing like what we'd recognize today. The overwhelming majority of Americans lived on farms. They grew their own food, raised their own livestock, built their own shelters. The idea of a job, in the modern sense of showing up to someone else's place of business in exchange for a fixed wage, was still relatively uncommon outside of port cities and a few early manufacturing centers. If a farmer had a bad harvest, he didn't think of himself as unemployed. He thought of himself as unlucky. He might barter with his neighbors, hunt more game, or tighten his belt until the next season. But as the 1800s progressed, something fundamental began to shift. The Industrial Revolution reached American shores, and it transformed everything. Factories sprouted up in New England and the mid-Atlantic states. Textile mills hummed along rivers. Ironworks belched smoke into the skies of Pennsylvania. And for the first time, millions of Americans left the land and migrated to cities to sell their labor for wages. This was a seismic change, and it introduced a vulnerability that agrarian life had never really known. When you worked on a farm, you might be poor, but you had land, you had crops, you had something. When you worked in a factory, you had a wage, and when that wage stopped, you had nothing. Your entire existence depended on the continued willingness of an employer to pay you, and that willingness could evaporate overnight for reasons entirely beyond your control. The first major test of this new vulnerability came with the Panic of 1837. It was one of America's earliest financial crises, triggered by a speculative land bubble and reckless lending by state-chartered banks. When the bubble burst, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Banks failed, businesses shuttered, and in New York City alone, historians estimate that more than half of the city's craft workers lost their jobs almost overnight. These were skilled tradesmen, carpenters, printers, tailors, shoemakers, people who had spent years learning their craft. And suddenly, they had nothing. There was no system to help them, no unemployment office, no government bureau. The federal government under President Martin Van Buren did not view the welfare of individual workers as a federal responsibility. That was considered a matter for private charity, for churches, for families. The prevailing political philosophy of the era held that government intervention in the economy was dangerous, that it would create dependency, that it would undermine the moral fiber of the working man. And so the government did what it would continue to do for almost another century. It watched. What the unemployed workers of 1837 actually did was what unemployed Americans would do again and again for generations. They begged, they scraped, they wandered. They leaned on whatever thin threads of support their communities could offer. Some went to almshouses, grim institutions run by local counties where the destitute could receive basic shelter and food in exchange for labor. These were not places anyone wanted to be. The conditions inside were deliberately harsh, designed to be so miserable that only the truly desperate would seek them out. The philosophy behind the almshouse was rooted in a deep suspicion of the poor, a belief that poverty was a character flaw, and that making relief too comfortable would encourage laziness. For those who refused the almshouse, the alternatives were even bleaker. You walked. You literally walked from town to town, knocking on doors, looking for any kind of work, seasonal labor on farms, day jobs at docks, chopping wood, digging ditches, whatever you could find. If you found nothing, you slept outside. You ate what you could scavenge, And if you were lucky, a church or a charitable society might give you a bowl of soup and a night on a cot before sending you on your way the next morning. This pattern, this brutal cycle of boom and bust with no safety net underneath, would repeat itself with devastating regularity throughout the entire 19th century. And each time the scale of the suffering grew larger, because the economy itself was growing larger, more interconnected, and more dependent on industrial wages. The Panic of 1873 was the next great catastrophe. It started when the Philadelphia banking firm of J. Cook and Company, one of the most prestigious financial houses in the country, declared bankruptcy after overextending itself on railroad investments. The collapse sent shockwaves through the entire financial system. The New York Stock Exchange shut down for 10 days. 89 of the country's 364 railroads went bankrupt. 18,000 businesses failed within 2 years, and unemployment surged to an estimated 14% of the labor force, a staggering number in an era when there was no mechanism to count the jobless and no system to support them. The depression that followed, known as the Long Depression, lasted 6 agonizing years, from 1873 to 1879. And during those years, the suffering of American workers reached a scale that the young nation had never experienced. In New York City, the number of families receiving charitable relief jumped from 5,000 in 1873 to 24,000 in 1874. Workers who had managed to keep their jobs saw their wages slashed to as little as $1 per day. And those who lost their jobs entirely faced a world that offered them almost nothing. The response of the government, at every level, was to do as little as possible. When 5,000 unemployed workers marched on Chicago's City Hall in December of 1873, demanding public works jobs or the distribution of charitable funds, the city's administration refused. The mayor argued that providing relief would deprive individuals of their independence and self-respect. Instead, he urged workers to take up self-help. This was not an unusual response. It was the standard one. The idea that government had any obligation to help unemployed workers was considered radical, even un-American, by the political establishment of the era. And so workers did what they could. They formed mutual aid societies, small organizations where members pooled their resources and provided modest benefits to one another during hard times. These societies were often organized along ethnic or occupational lines. Irish laborers had their own, German immigrants had theirs. Skilled tradesmen in specific crafts, bricklayers, cigar makers, iron molders, formed their own versions. Members paid small regular dues, and in return, if a member fell ill or lost his job, he might receive a few dollars a week for a limited time. It was better than nothing, but it was far from adequate. The funds were tiny, the benefits ran out quickly, and the societies themselves were fragile, prone to collapse during the very economic downturns when they were needed most. Some workers turned to a different kind of organization, the labor union. The 1870s and 1880s saw the rise of organizations like the Knights of Labor, and later, the American Federation of Labor. These unions fought primarily for better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions, but they also served as informal support networks for their members. A union brother who lost his job might receive help from his local chapter, a small loan, a tip about work in another town, a place to sleep. But unions covered only a small fraction of the workforce, and their power was constantly under assault from employers, courts, and the government itself. For the vast majority of American workers, there was simply no institutional support of any kind. If you lost your job, your options were stark. Find another one immediately, rely on family or friends, turn to private charity, enter the poorhouse, or take to the road as a tramp. And the word tramp carried a specific meaning in this era. It referred to the thousands upon thousands of men who wandered the countryside, riding freight trains, sleeping in fields and under bridges, moving from town to town in a desperate, endless search for work. By the 1870s and 1880s, tramping had become so widespread that it was practically its own subculture, complete with its own codes, symbols, and survival strategies. Tramps would leave chalk marks on fences and walls, a system of hieroglyphics that told the next man whether a particular household was generous with food or whether the local sheriff was hostile. Municipal authorities viewed these wandering unemployed men not as victims of economic forces beyond their control, but as threats to public order. Cities passed vagrancy laws that made it a crime to be homeless and jobless. A man could be arrested simply for not having visible means of support. The punishment was often a stint on a chain gang or in a local jail, which ironically provided the very thing the government refused to offer voluntarily: food and shelter. Then came the Panic of 1893, and it made everything that came before look like a rehearsal. This depression was triggered by a complex web of international financial instability, railroad overbuilding, and a crisis of confidence in the American dollar. When it hit hard. Over 600 banks failed. 16,000 businesses went under. The unemployment rate soared past 20% in many states, and in some industrial centers, 1 out of every 4 workers was out of a job. In Pennsylvania, the devastation was especially severe. In Chicago, Illinois, 100,000 people were sleeping in the streets. The scale of the crisis was so enormous that it overwhelmed every existing mechanism of private charity. Soup kitchens ran out of food, churches ran out of space, mutual aid societies ran out of money, and the government, once again, did essentially nothing. The federal government provided no relief whatsoever. President Grover Cleveland believed that the government had no constitutional authority to provide direct assistance to citizens, and famously declared that while the people should support the government should not support the people. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and abandonment that something unprecedented happened. In the spring of 1894, a businessman from Ohio named Jacob Coxey decided that if the government wouldn't come to the people would go to the government. He organized what became known as Coxey's Army, a march of unemployed workers from Massillon, Ohio, to Washington, D.C. It was the first significant protest march on the nation's capital in American history. Coxey's plan was straightforward. He proposed that the federal government issue $500 million in bonds to fund a massive public works program, building roads and infrastructure that would employ hundreds of thousands of jobless men. The idea was remarkably similar to what Franklin Roosevelt would actually implement nearly 4 decades later. But in 1894, it was considered wildly radical. About 100 men set out from Ohio on Easter Sunday, March 25th, 1894. They walked for over a month, picking up supporters along the way. By the time they reached Washington on May 1st, around 500 marchers had made the journey. 40 newspaper reporters followed them the entire way, making it one of the most covered events of the year. Newspapers alternated between portraying the marchers as dangerous radicals and as pitiable victims. Some called them tramps. Others called them the vanguard of revolution. The reception they received in Washington was telling. Rather than meeting with the marchers or addressing their grievances, the authorities arrested Coxey and his co-leaders the moment they stepped onto the Capitol lawn. The charge was trespassing. One congressman dismissed the march entirely, declaring that unemployment was an act of God. The newspapers largely joined the attack, accusing Coxey of propagating the most dangerous lesson that can be taught to the American people, the lesson of dependence on the government. No public works bill was passed. Coxey went to jail for 20 days. The marchers dispersed, and the Depression ground on for several more years, leaving millions to fend for themselves. Now, it's important to understand why America was so far behind the rest of the industrialized world on this issue, because while American workers were being told that unemployment was an act of God, European countries were already building systems to address it. Germany, under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, had introduced a comprehensive social insurance system in the 1880s, covering sickness, accidents, and old age pensions. Great Britain adopted one of the world's first systems of unemployment insurance in 1911, funded by a combination of employer and employee contributions and state subsidies. These were not acts of charity. They were structural recognitions that, in a modern industrial economy, unemployment was inevitable, and that leaving workers to face it alone was both cruel and economically destructive. But America resisted, and the reasons for that resistance were deeply embedded in the country's culture and political DNA. There was the tradition of rugged individualism, the belief that every man was the master of his own fate, and that success or failure was purely a matter of personal character. There was the powerful influence of industrialists and business owners who feared that any form of government-provided benefits would reduce their leverage over workers and drive up their costs. There was the suspicion of European-style socialism, which was viewed by many Americans as fundamentally incompatible with democratic capitalism. And there was the simple, stubborn inertia of a political system that was dominated by the interests of capital, not labor. Even organized labor itself was divided on the question. The American Federation of Labor, under the long leadership of Samuel Gompers, actually opposed compulsory unemployment insurance for decades. Gompers and the AFL believed that such legislation would tie workers to their jobs, open the door to discrimination against union members, and be less effective than their preferred solutions of shorter working hours and work-sharing arrangements. It wasn't until 1932, with millions of workers unemployed and the economy in free fall, that the AFL finally reversed its position and endorsed compulsory unemployment insurance. A few states tried to act on their own. Wisconsin became the first state to pass a law establishing an unemployment insurance program in 1932. But it was a modest program, and it stood alone. Other states considered similar legislation, but were paralyzed by a fear that would echo through every debate about labor regulation for generations: competitive disadvantage. If one state required employers to fund unemployment insurance and its neighboring states did not, businesses would simply relocate to the states with lower costs. It was a race to the bottom, and it effectively prevented any individual state from acting boldly. And then came the event that changed everything: the Great Depression. The stock market crash of October 1929 didn't immediately plunge the country into disaster. At first, many believed it was a temporary correction, a hiccup in an otherwise booming economy. President Herbert Hoover confidently predicted in March of 1930 that the worst of the unemployment would pass by that summer. He was catastrophically wrong. The unemployment numbers tell the story with a clarity that is almost unbearable. In 1929, fewer than 3 million Americans were out of work. By 1930, the number had risen to 4 million. By 1931, it was 8 million. By 1932, it was 12.5 million. And at the absolute nadir, in 1933, nearly 13 million Americans were unemployed, representing 24.9% of the total workforce. 1 in 4 working Americans had no job. But even those numbers don't capture the true scale of the human catastrophe. Because unemployment in the Great Depression didn't just mean a loss of income. It meant a loss of everything. Without any form of government assistance, a layoff was the first domino in a chain reaction of destruction. First, the savings went, then the credit, then the furniture and the personal possessions sold off piece by piece, then the rent couldn't be paid, then the eviction notice. In 1932 alone, 273,000 American families were evicted from their homes. By 1933, an estimated 2 million people were homeless in the United States. Where did they go? They went to the streets, they went to the parks, they went to the vacant lots on the edges of cities, where they built shelters out of whatever they could find, scraps of wood, flattened tin cans, old car doors, cardboard, tar paper. These makeshift settlements sprang up in every major city in the country, in New York, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Seattle, where the largest one occupied 9 acres of waterfront land. They were called Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, in bitter mockery of his failure to act. The name stuck because it captured something essential about the public mood, a sense of betrayal by a government that had promised prosperity and delivered ruin. The language of the era was saturated with this bitterness. Newspapers used as blankets were called Hoover blankets. Empty pockets turned inside out were Hoover flags. Broken down cars pulled by mules because their owners couldn't afford gasoline were Hoover wagons. Jackrabbits hunted for food were Hoover hogs. Even homeless men hitching rides on freight trains were called Hoover tourists. Every piece of slang was a small, sharp indictment of a government that had no answer for its people's suffering. The breadlines became the defining image of the era. Every morning, long before dawn, lines would begin to form outside soup kitchens and charitable distribution centers. Men, women, and children would stand for hours, sometimes in freezing cold or driving rain, waiting for a bowl of thin soup and a piece of bread. The lines stretched for blocks. They were orderly, quiet, and deeply humiliating. These were not people accustomed to charity. They were factory workers, clerks, salesmen, small business owners, people who had played by every rule and done everything right, and the system had simply failed them. The charities and churches that ran these operations were overwhelmed almost immediately. The sheer numbers were beyond anything they had ever dealt with or ever imagined dealing with. Private philanthropy, which had been the country's primary response to poverty for its entire history, simply could not handle a crisis of this magnitude. The problem was structural, systemic, national. It required a national response, and for years that response did not come. Hoover was not a heartless man, and it is unfair to paint him as one. He was, in fact, one of the most accomplished humanitarians of his generation. He had organized the feeding of millions of starving Europeans after the First World War, but he was ideologically opposed to direct federal relief for American citizens. He believed it would destroy individual initiative, undermine the moral character of the nation, and create a permanent class of dependents. He favored voluntary cooperation between business, government, and charity. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend money to banks and railroads, but he would not send a check to an unemployed worker. And as the Depression deepened, month after month, year after year, his philosophy looked less like principled restraint and more like willful blindness. It was into this cauldron of suffering and political failure that Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped when he won the presidential election of 1932. He came into office with a mandate for change that was as broad and as desperate as any president had ever received. And standing beside him, playing a role that history has not always given her full credit for, was a woman named Frances Perkins. Perkins was not a politician. She was a reformer, a social worker, a woman who had spent her entire adult life fighting for the rights of working people. She had studied economics and political science at some of the finest institutions in the country, and she had been radicalized not by theory but by experience. On the afternoon of March 25th, 1911, Perkins was having tea with friends near Washington Square Park in New York City when she heard the sound of fire trucks. She rushed to the scene and arrived at the Ash Building on Washington Place, where the upper floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were engulfed in flames. What she witnessed that afternoon would haunt her for the rest of her life and shape the course of American history. The factory employed hundreds of young women, mostly immigrants, who worked long hours sewing garments in cramped, dangerous conditions. The doors to the stairwells were locked. a common practice by factory owners to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks. When the fire broke out, the women were trapped. Some tried to escape down the fire escape, which collapsed under their weight. Others crowded into the elevators until the elevator shafts were clogged with bodies. And then, with nowhere else to go, they began to jump. Perkins watched as young women, some of them clasping hands, leaped from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors to the pavement below. 146 workers died that day. Most of them were young women. Some were as young as 14. Perkins later called that day the New Deal was born. It transformed her from an advocate into an activist, from a reformer into a revolutionary in the truest sense of the word. In the years that followed, she threw herself into the fight for workplace safety laws, labor regulations, and the protection of workers' rights. She served on New York's Factory Investigating Commission, became a member of the state's Industrial Commission, and eventually rose to become the state's Industrial Commissioner under Governor Franklin Roosevelt. When Roosevelt won the presidency in 1932, he asked Perkins to serve as his Secretary of Labor. She would be the first woman ever to hold a cabinet position in the United States government. She agreed, but she had a condition. She presented Roosevelt with a list of priorities that she wanted his support for. The list included a federal minimum wage, maximum hour laws, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, a ban on child labor, and workers' compensation. Roosevelt agreed to support all of them. In June of 1934, Roosevelt issued an executive order creating a cabinet-level committee on economic security, and he appointed Frances Perkins as its chair. The committee's mission was to study the problem of economic insecurity in America and to recommend legislation that would address it. Perkins gathered a team of scholars, actuaries, economists, and policy experts. They studied models from other countries, particularly the British and German systems of social insurance. They held hearings. They debated. They argued. And when the deadline for their report drew near and the committee was still struggling to finalize its recommendations, Perkins reportedly invited them to her home, placed a bottle of scotch on the parlor table, and told them they were not to leave until they had framed a legislative proposal. On January 15, 1935, the Committee on Economic Security presented its final report to President Roosevelt. 2 days later, Roosevelt sent the proposal to Congress asking for Social Security legislation. The bill included 3 major components: a system of old age pensions funded by payroll taxes, a federal state system of unemployment insurance funded by taxes on employers, and provisions for aid to dependent children and the disabled. The debate in Congress was fierce. Some lawmakers declared the bill unconstitutional. Others called it communism. Business groups lobbied against the unemployment insurance provisions, arguing that they would impose intolerable costs on employers and destroy the competitive free market. But the political winds were with Perkins and Roosevelt. The suffering of the Depression had radicalized the American public. People who had once believed in rugged individualism and the virtue of self-reliance had watched their neighbors lose everything through no fault of their own. The old arguments about moral character and government dependency rang hollow in a country where a quarter of the workforce couldn't find a job no matter how hard they tried. The bill passed the House of Representatives on April 19, 1935, and the Senate followed on June 19th, passing it by a vote of 77-6. On August 14, 1935, President Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law. It was, in many ways, the single most transformative piece of domestic legislation in American history. The unemployment insurance provisions of the Act created a joint federal-state system. The federal government imposed a tax on employers, and states were encouraged to pass their own unemployment insurance laws by offering a credit against the federal tax for employers who contributed to a state program. Within 2 years, every single state and the District of Columbia had approved their own unemployment insurance laws. By 1939, all state programs were fully operative. But it's essential to understand that the system created in 1935 was far from perfect and far from universal. The initial law applied only to employers with 8 or more employees, and only to those in commerce and industry. Massive segments of the American workforce were explicitly excluded. Agricultural workers, who were disproportionately Black and Latino, were left out. Domestic workers, who were overwhelmingly women of color, were left out. Government employees were excluded. Workers in small businesses were excluded. The exclusions were not accidental. They were the product of political compromises with Southern Democrats, who insisted that the New Deal's benefits not extend to the Black workers who formed the backbone of the Southern agricultural economy. It was racism, plain and simple, woven into the fabric of the legislation from the very beginning. So even after 1935, the question of what happened when you lost your job had very different answers depending on who you were and where you stood in America's racial and economic hierarchy. A white factory worker in Ohio might receive modest weekly benefits for a limited time. A Black sharecropper in Mississippi got nothing. A domestic worker in Georgia got nothing. The safety net, such as it was, had enormous holes in it, and those holes were not random. They were designed. Over the decades that followed, the system was gradually expanded. In 1954, coverage was extended to employers with 4 or more workers. By 1970, even businesses with a single employee were required to participate. Agricultural workers, domestic workers, and government employees were eventually brought under the umbrella, though the process was slow and uneven. But the fundamental structure of the system, a joint federal-state partnership funded by employer taxes, remained largely unchanged from the framework Perkins and her committee designed in 1934. Now, step back and consider the sheer weight of what we've been talking about. For 159 years, from the founding of the nation to 1935, the most powerful economy in the world had no unemployment insurance. During that time, the country experienced at least a dozen major financial panics and depressions. The Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1837, the Panic of 1857, the Catastrophic Depression of 1873 to 1879, the devastating Panic of 1893, the sharp recession of 1907, the Depression of 1920 to 1921, and finally, the Great Depression itself. Each of these crises threw millions of Americans out of work, and in every single case, the government's response was essentially the same. You're on your own. The human cost of that ideology is almost impossible to calculate. How many people starved? How many children went without meals, without education, without medical care? How many families were torn apart by the stress of sudden, total poverty? How many men walked the roads until their shoes wore through, sleeping under bridges and in ditches, looking for work that didn't exist? How many people died of exposure, of disease, of despair? There are no reliable statistics for most of this period, because nobody was counting. The suffering of the unemployed was largely invisible to the people who ran the country, and when it was visible, it was dismissed as the natural consequence of personal failure. What the story of unemployment insurance in America reveals is something uncomfortable about the relationship between a society and its most vulnerable members. The safety net that Americans take for granted today, the assumption that if you lose your job through no fault of your own, there will be some modest temporary support to help you get through, that assumption is extraordinarily recent. It didn't exist for most of American history, and it wasn't created because the people in power suddenly developed a sense of compassion. It was created because the suffering became so vast, so undeniable, so threatening to the stability of the entire social order, that doing nothing was no longer a viable political option. The Great Depression didn't change America's mind about unemployment insurance because it introduced a new argument. The arguments had been there for decades. European countries had acted on them a generation earlier. What the Depression did was remove the ability to look away. When a quarter of the country was out of work, when Hoovervilles dotted the landscape of every major city, when breadlines stretched for blocks in broad daylight, the old story about rugged individualism and personal responsibility became impossible to maintain. The fiction that unemployment was a character flaw collapsed under the weight of 12 million living, breathing counterexamples. And yet, even then, even in the depths of the worst economic catastrophe in the nation's history, the creation of unemployment insurance was a fight. It was opposed by powerful business interests, by ideological conservatives, by Southern politicians who wanted to preserve racial hierarchies, and even by some labor leaders who feared government control. Francis Perkins had to push, cajole, strategize, and compromise to get the Social Security Act through Congress. It was not inevitable. It was not a foregone conclusion. It was a political achievement, hard-won and deeply contested. The legacy of that fight is still with us. The unemployment insurance system that Perkins helped create has been expanded and reformed over the decades, but its fundamental tensions remain. It still varies dramatically from state to state. Benefit amounts differ. Duration differs. Eligibility requirements differ. Some states are generous, others are punishingly stingy. And the debate about whether unemployment benefits encourage dependency or provide essential support has never really gone away. You heard versions of it during the Great Recession of 2008. You heard it during the pandemic of 2020. The same arguments that were deployed against Jacob Coxey in 1894, that relief would create dependence and undermine the moral fiber of the worker, are still being recycled today, repackaged in modern language, but fundamentally unchanged. What's different now is that we have the data. We know that unemployment insurance doesn't just help individual workers. It stabilizes the broader economy by maintaining consumer spending during downturns. We know that it reduces poverty, prevents homelessness, and keeps families intact during periods of economic stress. We know that the cost of not having it, the cost that America paid for 159 years, is measured not just in dollars, but in lives destroyed, in potential wasted, in suffering that was entirely preventable. The story of how America got unemployment insurance is not just a story about policy. It's a story about what a society owes to the people who build it. It's about the gap between what a nation says it believes and what it actually does for its citizens. And it's a reminder that the things we think of as permanent features of modern life, the safety nets, the protections, the basic guarantees, are not natural laws. They are human creations, born out of crisis, forged in political battle, and always, always vulnerable to being taken away. Because before 1935, there was nothing. And the only reason there's something now is because millions of people suffered enough, and loudly enough, and visibly enough, that the country could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. That's the real story. Not just that America had no unemployment insurance until 1935, but that for 159 years, losing your job in the richest country on earth meant you were completely, utterly on your own. And the fact that we changed that eventually is both a cause for pride and a reason for vigilance, because the forces that kept that safety net from being built for over a century didn't disappear when Francis Perkins got the Social Security Act signed. They just went quiet for a while. And quiet doesn't mean gone. If this story gave you a new perspective on something you might have taken for granted, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. These are the kinds of stories that don't get told enough, the ones hiding in plain sight behind the systems we live inside every day. There's a lot more where this came from, and I'll see you in the next one.